Sarah was 9 years old when she committed the unforgivable sin. She taught herself to read. In 1883, Mississippi, a black child with a book was more dangerous than a black man with a gun. Reading was white people's power, their magic, their weapon, and they guarded it jealously. Black children were supposed to learn only 3 things: how to work, how to obey, and how to stay silent. Sarah learned all 3, but she also learned a 4th thing that nobody had given her permission to know. She learned that marks on paper could speak, that letters could form words, that words could reveal truths. And once she started reading, she couldn't stop. She read everything she could find: torn newspapers, discarded envelopes, feed sacks, shipping labels. She practiced writing letters in the dirt of the stable where she worked, drawing them over and over until her fingers remembered their shapes. She hid books under her dress, studied by candlelight while her family slept, and risked everything for something most people took for granted. What she didn't know was that her forbidden education would lead her to discover secrets so terrible that an entire family would die to keep them buried. This is the true story of how knowledge became the most dangerous weapon a child could possess, and how the truth she uncovered would end in flames, death, and a mystery that authorities would refuse to investigate. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment freedom so I know who you are. Let's grow this community together. Thank you. And now, let's return to the story. On the night of March 17, 1891, the Whitmore mansion burned in orange flames that lit up the Warren County, Mississippi sky like hell itself had risen to the surface of the earth. When volunteer firefighters finally controlled the fire 3 hours later, they found something they could never explain: 5 charred bodies arranged in a perfect circle in the main hall, as if someone had carefully placed them there before the flames consumed everything. The most disturbing part wasn't the bodies themselves, but the fact that each one had their hands crossed over their chest in a position that would be impossible to maintain while running from a fire. The local sheriff, William Tucker, walked through the ruins with his deputy at dawn, their boots crunching on broken glass and charred wood. Tucker had seen death before, plenty of it, but nothing like this. The bodies were positioned too deliberately, too carefully. It looked like a ritual. The official report filed on March 19, 1891 listed the cause as accidental fire due to overturned oil lamp. The case was closed in 48 hours. No investigation, no questions, just 5 coffins and a mass funeral that half the county attended. But in the colored quarters, in the cabins where black families lived and worked, people whispered a different story. They spoke of secrets buried in plantation ledgers, of experiments done in basement rooms, and of a 9-year-old girl who had learned to read when she wasn't supposed to. The year was 1883, when our story truly begins. 8 years before that terrible fire, the Whitmore Plantation stretched across 1/200th acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, where cotton grew thick and profits flowed even thicker into the pockets of Jonathan Whitmore and his wife Margaret. They owned the land, the cotton, the equipment, and in every way that mattered in 1883, they owned the people who worked it. Though slavery had officially ended 18 years earlier with the passage of the 13th Amendment, the reality on the ground told a different story. Sharecropping and debt pawnage had replaced chains and auction blocks, but the power dynamics remained brutally unchanged. Black families worked the same fields their ancestors had bled on, now paying rent to live in the same cabins where their grandparents had been enslaved, borrowing money for seeds and tools at interest rates that guaranteed they would never, ever be free of debt. Jonathan Whitmore was 52 years old in 1883, a tall man with gray hair and a beard that he kept meticulously trimmed. He wore expensive suits imported from New York and spoke with the refined accent of someone who had been educated at the University of Virginia. On Sundays, he sat in the front pew of the First Baptist Church, where Reverend Morrison praised him as a pillar of the community and a godly man who treated his workers fairly. But fairness is a relative term. The Whitmores paid their sharecroppers $400 per 100 pounds of picked cotton while charging them $8 per month for cabin rent, $12 for seed and supplies, and $15 for food from the plantation store. A family could pick 3,000 pounds of cotton in a good month and still end the season deeper in debt than when they started. Margaret Whitmore was 48, a thin woman with sharp features and eyes that never seemed to blink. She ran the household with military precision, managing servants, organizing social events, and maintaining the family's reputation among Mississippi's planter class. She had 3 sons, Jonathan Jr., aged 25, who managed the day-to-day plantation operations. Richard, age 22, who had studied medicine at Tulane University in New Orleans, and Thomas, age 12, the surprised late-life child who spent most of his time reading books in the library while his older brothers worked. The Whitmore children learned piano, French, mathematics, and literature from private tutors who came 3 times per week. They ate 3 meals per day at a mahogany dining table that cost $340, served by black women who earned $2 per month. They slept in beds with cotton sheets picked by black hands under roofs repaired by black carpenters in rooms cleaned by black maids. They grew up believing this was natural, that God Himself had ordained this arrangement, that the color of your skin determined not just your place in society but your worth as a human being. The black children on the Whitmore plantation learned something different. They learned that white people's words could hurt as much as their fists. They learned that looking at a book could get you beaten. They learned that curiosity was dangerous and questions were forbidden. They learned to make themselves small, quiet, invisible. They learned that their parents' exhaustion was normal, that hunger was expected, that pain was just part of life. And they learned, above all else, that education was not for them. Reading was white people's magic, and black children who tried to steal that magic paid terrible prices. Sarah was born in the winter of 1874 in a cabin at the edge of the Whitmore property, the 3rd child of Ruth and Samuel, who worked the cotton fields from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Her first memories were of her mother's cracked hands and her father's bent back, of hunger that gnawed at her stomach most nights, and of the constant warnings whispered by every adult around her. Keep your head down. Don't look white folks in the eye. Don't ask questions. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't ever, ever make them notice you. Being invisible was survival. Being forgotten was safety. But Sarah was born with something her parents feared: curiosity. At age 5, she watched white children ride past her cabin in a carriage, books in their laps, and wondered what magic lived inside those pages. At age 6, she found a torn newspaper page blowing across the cotton field and stared at the strange symbols until her mother snatched it away and burned it in the cooking fire. At age 7, she asked her father why black children couldn't go to school, and he slapped her across the face, not out of anger but out of terror, whispering urgently that questions like that could get them all killed. In 1883, when Sarah turned 9 years old, Mississippi had exactly 0 public schools for black children in rural areas. The Reconstruction Amendments had promised equality, but the reality was Jim Crow laws that kept races separate and opportunities unequal. In Warren County, white children attended the Warren County Public School, a 2-story brick building with 8 classrooms, 2 teachers, and books donated by families in Boston. Black children attended nothing. Some parents scraped together money for informal schooling in church basement where volunteer teachers risked violence to teach basic reading and arithmetic. But the Whitmore plantation was too remote, too controlled. Jonathan Whitmore had made his position clear to all his workers. Education makes Negroes rebellious, lazy, and dissatisfied with honest work. Any family caught teaching their children to read would be evicted immediately and blacklisted from work in the entire county. This was the world Sarah lived in. This was the cage that held her. But cages only work if the prisoner doesn't realize there's a door. And Sarah, against every warning and every threat, was about to find that door. The Whitmore stable was Sarah's workplace starting in the spring of 1883 when she turned 9 years old. Children began working as soon as they were strong enough to carry a bucket or push a broom, and Sarah had been assigned to help old Moses, the headstand, care for the family's 5 horses. The work started at 5 in the morning before sunrise, when the Mississippi heat was still bearable. She would haul water from the well, spread fresh hay in the stalls, brush down the horses, and clean the tack. The smell of horse manure and leather became as familiar to her as breathing. Moses was 67 years old, born into slavery on this very plantation in 1816. He had lived through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the betrayal of broken promises and the slow return of white supremacy under a different name. He moved slowly now, his joints stiff with arthritis, his back permanently bent from decades of labor. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. He had learned long ago that words were dangerous, that opinions could get you killed, that the safest response to any question from white folks was, "Yes, sir," or "No, ma'am." But Moses noticed things. He noticed that Sarah's eyes followed the white children when they studied with their tutor on the veer. He noticed how she stared at the newspapers that Mr. Jonathan read and then discarded in the stable. He noticed the way her fingers traced patterns in the dirt floor as if practicing something, and it worried him deeply because he had seen what happened to black children who wanted more than they were allowed to have. One morning in June 1883, Sarah found a page torn from a book lying in the horse stall. It must have fallen from Thomas Whitmore's pocket when he came to ride his mare the day before. The page was from a primer, a children's reading book with large letters and simple words. At the top of the page was a drawing of an apple, and beneath it, 6 letters, a PLE. Sarah stared at those letters like they were a message from God himself. She knew what an apple was, had seen them in the Whitmore orchard, had tasted one once when Mrs. Margaret gave spoiled fruit to the workers, but she had never connected that round red fruit with these strange symbols on paper. She hid the page under her shirt and carried it with her all day, afraid someone would find it, afraid it would disappear like the newspaper her mother had burned years ago. That night, by candlelight in her family's cabin, she took out the page and studied it while her parents slept. Her older brother James, age 11, saw what she was doing and hissed at her to put it away. Her younger sister Ruth Jr., age 6, watched with wide eyes but said nothing. Sarah ignored them both. She stared at those 6 letters until they burned into her memory, a PLE. The next day, she began to experiment. In the dirt floor of the stable, when Moses wasn't looking, she used a stick to draw the letters. A-P-P-L-E. She didn't know if she was doing it right, didn't know if the shapes matched, but she tried. She drew them over and over, erasing with her foot, and redrawing until Moses shuffled over and saw what she was doing. He froze. His eyes went wide with fear. He grabbed the stick from her hand and threw it across the stable. "Don't you never do that again, girl," he whispered urgently. "Don't you never, you hear me? They catch you doing that. They're going to kill you. They're going to kill your whole family." Sarah looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I just want to know what the letters mean, Mr. Moses. I just want to know." Moses stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face full of pain and fear and something else. Something that looked like grief. Finally, he spoke so quietly she almost couldn't hear him. "Child, there's things in this world that ain't for us. Reading is white folks' power, and they don't share power with nobody. You try to take it, they're going to make an example out of you. You understand me?" But Sarah didn't understand. Not really. She didn't understand why symbols on paper should belong to one group of people and not another. She didn't understand why wanting to read was worse than wanting food or shelter or freedom. She didn't understand. And because she didn't understand, she couldn't stop herself from trying. Over the next 3 months, Sarah collected scraps of written material the way a starving person collects crumbs, a torn envelope in the trash, a damaged feed sack with printed letters, a discarded advertisement for farming equipment. She hid them in a hole she dug beneath the floorboards of the stable, covering it with a loose board and a pile of hay. At night, by the weak light of a tallow candle, she practiced drawing letters in a notebook she had made from scraps of brown paper stitched together with thread stolen from her mother's sewing kit. She had no teacher, no guide, no system. She worked purely by observation and repetition. She noticed that certain letters appeared together frequently. She began to recognize patterns. The letter T often appeared at the start of words followed by H and E. She saw it everywhere once she noticed it. They appeared in newspapers, on signs, in books. It was like discovering that the sky had always been blue, but she had never known the word for that color before. By September 1883, Sarah could recognize maybe 30 words by sight. The and of 2 in A4, with horse water, Plantation, Whitmore, Mississippi. She didn't know grammar or pronunciation. She didn't know how to sound out new words, but she was learning slowly, secretly, dangerously. Then one afternoon in October, everything changed. Thomas Whitmore, the youngest son, came to the stable to check on his horse. He was 12 years old, small for his age, with his mother's thin frame and his father's gray eyes. Unlike his older brothers who treated black workers like furniture, Thomas sometimes said thank you when Sarah brought him water or held his horse. He didn't smile at her, didn't speak more than necessary, but he also didn't spit at her or call her the vile names his brothers used. In Sarah's world, this small absence of cruelty felt almost like kindness. Thomas was carrying a stack of books from his tutoring session, and when he dismounted his horse, one of the books fell into a water trough. He cursed and pulled it out, the pages dripping wet, ruined. Without thinking, Sarah spoke. "I can dry it, sir. I can spread the pages in the sun." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her for maybe the first time. You know what this is? Sarah hesitated, then nodded. It's a book, sir. You know what books are for? Another hesitation. This felt like a trap, but she answered honestly. For learning, sir, for reading. Thomas studied her face for a long moment. Can you read? Sarah knew the right answer was no. The safe answer was no. But something in his voice wasn't mocking or angry. It was curious. And so, against every survival instinct her parents had drilled into her, she said, I'm trying to learn, sir. Just a little bit. She expected him to laugh or to get angry or to run tell his father. Instead, Thomas did something she never anticipated. He said, Show me. With shaking hands, Sarah took the wet book from him. It was a history textbook with small print and no pictures. She opened it to a random page and scanned the lines until she found a word she recognized. She pointed at it. She said quietly. She moved her finger down the page. End of 2. 4 words out of hundreds, but they were hers. Thomas's eyes widened. Who taught you? Nobody, sir. I taught myself from scraps. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then he reached into his school bag and pulled out a small book, a primer, like the one the torn page had come from. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, then thrust the book into her hands. Hide this. Don't let anyone see it. When you finish it, leave it in the horse stall under the hay pile. I'll check next week. Sarah clutched the book to her chest like it was made of gold. Why are you helping me? Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable. I don't know. Maybe because my tutor says education is the greatest gift. Or maybe because everyone says Negroes are too stupid to learn and I want to know if that's true. It wasn't kindness. It was curiosity. Maybe even a scientific experiment to him. But Sarah didn't care. She had a real book with real lessons and a chance to learn. She hid it under her dress and worked the rest of the day in a daze, afraid someone would notice her trembling hands and flushed face. That night, she didn't sleep. By candlelight, she opened the primer and began to study. The book was designed for 6-year-old children with pictures and simple words. Cat, dog, run, sit. Each word was accompanied by an illustration that showed its meaning. Sarah traced each letter with her finger, whispering the sounds under her breath. By morning, she had worked through 10 pages and could recognize 20 new words. Over the next 4 months, Sarah devoured that primer, like a starving person, finally given food. She studied every spare moment, hiding the book in her dress during the day under her thin mattress at night. She practiced writing letters in the stable dirt, erasing them quickly before anyone could see. She began to understand how letters made sounds, how sounds made words, how words made meaning. The entire world was suddenly full of messages she had never been able to read before. Signs, labels, documents. Every written word was a door she could now open. By February 1884, she had finished the primer and left it in the horse stall as Thomas had instructed. 3 days later, she found another book hidden in the same spot, a second-grade reader with more complex words and longer sentences. A note was tucked inside, written in Thomas's careful handwriting. You're doing well. Keep going. This pattern continued for 2 years. Thomas would leave books, Sarah would study them and return them, and slowly, painstakingly, she learned to read. By her 11th birthday in winter 1885, Sarah could read at roughly a 4th grade level. She could sound out unfamiliar words, understand basic grammar, and comprehend simple texts. She read everything Thomas gave her, readers, history books, even a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe. She absorbed it all like dry ground soaking up rain. But the more she learned, the more questions she had. The history books Thomas gave her described the Civil War as a noble conflict to preserve the Union, barely mentioning slavery except as a side issue. They described black people as childlike and simple, needing white guidance and protection. They explained that segregation was natural, that different races couldn't live together as equals, that God himself had ordained racial hierarchy. Sarah read these words and felt confused, angry, betrayed. Was this really what white people believed? The black people were meant to serve, to obey, to be grateful for crumbs. One day in March 1885, Sarah found Thomas in the stable alone brushing his horse. She had been building up courage for weeks, and finally she spoke. Mr. Thomas, sir, can I ask you something? Thomas looked up, surprised. They rarely spoke directly. What is it? The books you give me, they say colored people are meant to be servants. They say we're not as smart as white folks, that we need you to take care of us. Is that what you believe?" Thomas stopped brushing his horse. His face went red, and for a moment Sarah thought she had made a terrible mistake. But then he spoke, his voice quiet. "I don't know what I believe anymore. My father says Negroes are inferior by nature. My brothers say you're all lazy and dishonest. But you learned to read from scraps of paper in 2 years, Sarah. You work harder than anyone I know. So either my family is wrong or you're some kind of exception. And I don't think you're an exception." It was the most honest thing anyone white had ever said to her. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. Then why do they treat us like this? Why do they keep us poor and hungry and ignorant? Thomas was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Because if they admitted you were equal, they'd have to admit what they've done to you is wrong, and they'd rather die than admit that." Those words would prove more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. In April 1885, something changed at the Whitmore plantation. Richard Whitmore, the middle son who had studied medicine at Tulane, returned home after 3 years in New Orleans. He came back with a medical degree, a leather doctor's bag, and ideas that made even his father uncomfortable. Richard was 25 years old, tall like his father, but with a cruel mouth and cold eyes. He had graduated near the bottom of his medical school class. But in 1885, Mississippi, a white man with any medical degree was considered a doctor, and Richard set up a practice in the plantation's East Wing. But Richard wasn't interested in treating sick farmers or delivering babies. He had bigger ambitions. During his time in New Orleans, he had become fascinated with a pseudo-scientific movement called racial biology, which claimed to prove through measurements and experiments that white people were naturally superior to all other races. Scientists at prestigious universities were publishing papers claiming that skull size determined intelligence, that bone structure revealed criminal tendencies, that pain sensitivity varied by race. It was all garbage, racist nonsense dressed up in scientific language, but it was taken seriously by educated people across America and Europe. Richard had read these studies and become convinced that he could make his name by contributing original research to the field. He believed that black people felt pain differently than white people, that their bodies were somehow tougher, more animal-like. If he could prove this through experiments, he would be published in medical journals, invited to speak at conferences, recognized as a serious scientist. The fact that his experiments would require test subjects, and that he had dozens of black workers right here on his family's plantation who couldn't refuse him, made it all very convenient. He started small. In May 1885, he began examining plantation workers, measuring their skulls with calipers, recording the shape of their noses and lips, noting skin color variations. He wrote everything down in a leather-bound journal, filling page after page with pseudoscientific observations. Subject number 1, male, age 34, very dark skin, pronounced African features, skull circumference 21 inches, suggesting limited intellectual capacity. Subject number 2, female, age 28, lighter skin, possibly indicating white ancestry, more refined features, potentially more educable than pure African types. The workers endured these examinations because they had no choice. Richard was a Whitmore, and refusing a Whitmore meant eviction, blacklisting, possibly violence. So they stood still while he measured them like livestock, humiliating them with his touch and his stares and his scribbled notes that reduced them to numbers and racial characteristics. But measurements weren't enough for Richard. By June, he had moved on to more invasive experiments. He wanted to test pain response, so he began conducting procedures without anesthetic on black workers who came to him with injuries or illness. A man with a broken finger would have it set without anything to numb the pain while Richard watched closely, timing how long it took for the patient to cry out. A woman with an infected tooth would have it pulled without laudanum. While Richard noted her reactions in his journal, he convinced himself this wasn't cruelty. It was science. He was gathering data, contributing to human knowledge, proving theories that great minds had proposed. Sarah first heard about Richard's experiments from her mother in July 1885. Ruth came home from working in the big house with tears running down her face and bruises on her arms. "That doctor, that devil Richard," she whispered to Sarah's father while Sarah pretended to sleep. "He's doing things to people, terrible things." Jenny's boy went to him with a cut on his leg, and Richard poured something on it that burned like fire just to see how the boy would react. Didn't treat the cut, didn't help him, just hurt him and wrote it down in his book. Samuel's voice was heavy with grief and rage. "I know, but what can we do? We can't fight them. We can't leave. We just got to survive." "How many of our people got to suffer before surviving ain't enough?" Ruth asked, but she already knew the answer. All of them. They would all suffer for as long as white folks wanted them to suffer because that's how the world worked in 1885 Mississippi. Sarah lay awake that night thinking about what she had heard. She thought about the books Thomas had given her, about the history texts that described slavery as a benevolent institution where happy Negroes sang in the fields. She thought about the medical journals Richard probably read full of lies disguised as facts. And she realized that words on paper weren't just information, they were weapons. White people used words to justify cruelty, to make evil sound reasonable, to convince themselves and others that black people deserved their suffering. If words could be weapons for white people, Sarah thought, maybe they could be weapons for black people too. Maybe if she could read well enough, learn enough, understand enough, she could find proof of what was really happening here. Maybe she could document the truth the way Richard documented his lies. Maybe written words could be used to fight back. It was a dangerous thought. It was probably an impossible thought. But once Sarah had it, she couldn't let it go. Over the next year, Sarah's education took on a new purpose. She wasn't just learning to read anymore. She was learning to understand the systems that kept her people oppressed. Thomas, unaware of what was happening with his brother, continued to provide books, and Sarah read them with new eyes. She read about law and government, about contracts and property rights, about the Constitution and its amendments. She learned that on paper, black people had rights. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under law. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. But paper rights meant nothing when sheriffs looked the other way, when judges were sympathetic to white defendants, when juries would never convict a white man for crimes against black victims. The law protected white people and their property. Black people were tolerated as long as they stayed in their place and punished brutally when they didn't. By summer 1886, when Sarah was 12 years old, Richard's experiments had escalated to the point where workers were actively hiding when they got sick or injured, preferring to suffer in silence rather than become one of his test subjects. The stories that circulated through the colored quarters became more and more disturbing. Richard had supposedly opened a man's leg wound to measure how deep he could cut before the patient passed out from pain. He had burned a woman's arm with heated metal to test tissue damage and recovery time. He had given a child a medicine that made him vomit for hours just to observe the effects. None of this was written down in any official record. Subjects were black sharecroppers who nobody knew about. Subjects were black sharecroppers who nobody cared about. If they died or were permanently injured, well, that was the cost of scientific progress. But Richard did keep one record, his personal research journal. It was a thick, leather-bound book that he carried with him everywhere, filling it with detailed notes about his experiments. He wrote down names, dates, procedures, and results. He sketched diagrams of wounds and burns. He noted which techniques caused the most pain, which individuals had the highest or lowest pain tolerance, which types of injuries healed quickest on black skin versus white skin. It was all there, every crime documented in his own handwriting, preserved as scientific data. Sarah first saw the journal in August 1886, when Richard left it on a table in the stable while he examined his horse for lameness. She was sweeping nearby, invisible as always, and she glanced at the open pages. What she saw made her stomach turn. There was a sketch of a human arm, marked with measurements and notes. Below it, Richard had written, Subject number 17, female, age 19, tested pain response with incremental burning. Subject maintained consciousness until third-degree burn reached 4 square inches. Pain tolerance remarkable. Potential evidence of reduced nerve sensitivity in Negro populations. Subject number 17 was Clara Ara, a girl Sarah had known her whole life. Clara, who sang in the church choir. Clara, who had dreams of marrying her sweetheart and moving north. Clara, who now walked with her right arm wrapped in dirty bandages because Richard had burned her in the name of science. Sarah felt rage rise in her throat like vomit. This journal was evidence. This journal proved what Richard was doing. If someone could read it, someone in authority, someone with power, maybe Richard could be stopped. Maybe justice could actually happen. But who would believe a black child's word about what she had read? Who would take her testimony seriously? Who would even give her the chance to speak? The answer, Sarah realized, was nobody. Nobody in 1886 Mississippi would listen to a 12-year-old Negro girl, no matter what truth she spoke. But maybe they would listen to the journal itself. Maybe if she could get it into the right hands, or copy what it said, or somehow expose Richard's crimes through his own words, something could change. It was dangerous. It was probably impossible. But Sarah had spent 3 years learning to read for a reason, and that reason had just become crystal clear. She started planning. Over the next 2 months, Sarah observed Richard's routines carefully. The journal stayed with him most of the time, but occasionally he would set it down when he was treating his horse or talking with his brothers. Those moments were brief, maybe 5 or 10 minutes at most, but they were opportunities. Sarah began keeping her own notebook, a small collection of brown paper pages hidden in the stable where she could quickly copy anything important if she got the chance. The opportunity came on October 12, 1886. Richard had been called to the main house urgently because his mother had fallen and possibly broken her wrist. He dropped his medical bag and journal on the stable workbench and rushed out. Sarah was alone. Moses had gone to fetch water. She had maybe 10 minutes before anyone returned. Her hands shook as she opened the journal. The pages were covered in Richard's careful handwriting filled with medical terminology she didn't fully understand, but could read well enough to grasp their meaning. She flipped through quickly, looking for something particularly damning, something that would prove without doubt what Richard was doing. She found it on page 47. The entry was dated July 15, 1886, and it described an experiment on a child. Subject number NER 23, male, age 8, tested pain response to surgical procedure without anesthetic. Subject required physical restraint by 2 assistants. Incision made in lower abdomen approximately 3 inches deep. Subject lost consciousness after 4 minutes of procedure. Wound sutured and subject recovered. Conclusion: even juvenile Negro specimens demonstrate remarkable pain tolerance, supporting hypothesis of fundamental biological differences between races. Subject number 23 was Moses's grandson, little James, who had been sick with stomach pains and fever. Richard had told the family he was performing unnecessary surgery to save the boy's life, but this entry made it clear the surgery wasn't medical treatment. It was an experiment. Richard had cut open a conscious 8-year-old child just to see how he would react to pain. Sarah's hand moved almost on its own. She grabbed her pencil and began copying the entry word for word onto her brown paper. Her handwriting was shaky but legible. She copied the date, the subject number, and the entire description of what Richard had done. She was halfway through when she heard footsteps approaching. She slammed the journal shut, shoved her paper under her shirt, and grabbed a broom just as Richard walked back into the stable. He glanced at her at the journal on the workbench, then back at her. "What are you doing?" "Sweeping, sir," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "Just sweeping like always." Richard stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his journal and walked away. Sarah swept the floor with trembling hands, the copied page pressed against her skin like a burning secret. That night she showed the paper to her father. Samuel read it slowly, his lips moving as he worked through the words, his face growing darker with each sentence. When he finished, he looked at his daughter with fear and pride and terrible sadness. "This is proof," he said quietly. "This proves what that devil's doing." "Can we show it to someone?" Sarah asked. "Can we take it to the sheriff, to a judge?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "Baby girl, you think any white man in Mississippi is going to believe this came from a Negro child who taught herself to read? They going to say you made it up? Or are they going to say, even if it's true, Richard had a right to do it because we ain't fully human in their eyes? Or are they going to ask where you got this information, and when they find out you've been reading when you ain't supposed to, they going to punish all of us? So we just let him keep hurting people?" "No," Samuel said firmly. "We keep this paper safe. We keep gathering proof if we can, and we wait for the right moment when somebody might actually listen. But Sarah, you got to understand something. This knowledge you got, this reading you learned, it makes you dangerous to white folks. Not just dangerous to you, dangerous to all of us. You got to be careful." But careful wasn't enough because someone had noticed Sarah's education. Someone had been watching, and that someone was about to turn Sarah's dangerous knowledge into deadly consequences. Jonathan Jr., the eldest Whitmore son, had been suspicious of Thomas for months. He had noticed his younger brother sneaking books from the library and coming back without them. He had seen Thomas spending time in the stable talking to that Negro girl who worked there. He had watched and waited and finally decided to investigate. On October 20th, 1886, Jonathan Jr. followed Thomas to the stable and watched through a crack in the wall as Thomas left a book in the hay pile where Sarah would find it. He watched as Sarah retrieved the book an hour later and hid it under her dress. He watched her return to her work as if nothing had happened. That evening, Jonathan Jr. went to his father. "We have a problem," he said. Thomas has been teaching that Negro girl to read. Jonathan Sr.'s face went white, then red with rage. Teaching Negroes to read violated every social rule, every understanding of how the races should interact. It was betrayal of his own kind, corruption of the racial order, dangerous rebellion that could spread like disease if not stopped immediately. That night, Jonathan Sr. confronted Thomas in the library. Sarah, who was helping her mother serve dinner in the next room, heard every word through the thin walls. "You've been giving books to that Negro child." Jonathan Sr. His voice was cold with fury. "Yes, sir." Thomas's voice was quiet but steady. "She wanted to learn." "I thought you thought what?" "That you could make her white? That education would change what she is." "Boy, you're either stupid or you're a traitor to your own blood. I just wanted to see if she could learn." "Father, everyone says Negroes are too stupid, but Sarah isn't stupid. She's actually quite—" The sound of a slap echoed through the house. "Don't you dare compare that animal to yourself. Don't you dare. Do you understand what you've done? You've created a Negro who can read, who thinks she's equal to white people who might teach others. Do you know what happens when Negroes get educated? They get rebellious. They get ideas. They start thinking they deserve rights and respect. You've made her dangerous, Thomas. And dangerous Negroes have to be dealt with." Sarah stood frozen in the dining room, her mother's hand gripping her shoulder so hard it hurt. They both knew what dealt with meant. It meant violence. It meant public punishment. It meant making an example that every other black person would see and remember and fear. "Father, please," Thomas was saying, "don't hurt her. She's just a child. This was my fault, not hers. Oh, I know it's your fault, boy, and you'll be punished too. But she's the one who's going to learn what happens when Negroes step out of their place." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She ran out the back door into the night, her mother calling after her in a desperate whisper. She ran to the cabin and grabbed the paper she had copied from Richard's journal, the only proof she had of what the Whiters were really doing. She ran to the woods at the edge of the plantation where slaves had once hidden when they tried to escape, where the trees were thick enough to hide a child. She stayed hidden for 2 days, sleeping in a hollow log, drinking from a creek, eating berries that grew wild. She heard men calling her name, heard dogs barking, heard her mother's voice begging her to come out. But she stayed hidden because she knew that if they caught her, they would punish her in front of everyone, and then they would burn any proof that she could read, and everything she had learned would be for nothing. On the 3rd day, Thomas found her. He came alone without dogs or other men, and he sat down near her hiding place and spoke quietly. "Sarah, I know you're here. I know you're scared, but you need to come out. My father is going to hurt your family if you don't. He's going to evict them, blacklist them, maybe worse. You can't let them suffer for what I did." Sarah emerged slowly from the hollow log. She was dirty, hungry, exhausted. Thomas looked at her with guilt written all over his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping you. I didn't think about what would happen if we got caught." "What's going to happen to me?" Sarah asked. Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. "My father wants to make an example. He's going to have you whipped in front of all the workers, 20 lashes. He says it's merciful because you're just a child, but really he wants everyone to see what happens when Negroes try to educate themselves." 20 lashes. Sarah had seen adults whipped before, had seen the scars that lasted a lifetime. 20 lashes on a 12-year-old's back would destroy her, might even kill her, and my family. If you submit to punishment, they'll be allowed to stay. If you run, they'll be evicted and blacklisted. It wasn't a choice. It was a trap. Sarah could run and destroy her family, or she could submit to torture to save them. She was 12 years old, and this was the price of learning to read. "I'll submit," she said quietly. "But first, I need to hide something." She showed Thomas the paper she had copied from Richard's journal. "This is proof of what your brother's doing. Proof that he's experimenting on people, hurting them for science. If something happens to me, someone needs to know about this." Thomas took the paper and read it. His face went pale. "This can't be real. Richard wouldn't. He did. I copied it from his journal." "Every word is true." Thomas folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "I'll keep this safe," he promised. "And after my father punishes you, I'll make sure you get medical treatment. I'll do whatever I can to help." It was the best promise he could make, and they both knew it wouldn't be enough. The whipping happened the next day, November 1st, 1886, in the main yard where all the workers could see. They tied Sarah to a post, her hands above her head, her back exposed. Jonathan Sr. read out her crime in a loud voice. This Negro child has been caught learning to read, which is an act of rebellion and theft of white knowledge. She will receive 20 lashes as punishment, and let this be a lesson to all the coloreds on this plantation. Education is not your right. Your place is to work, to obey, and to be grateful for the protection and guidance we provide. Sarah's mother was forced to watch. Her father was forced to watch. Every black person on the plantation was forced to watch as Jonathan Jr. raised the whip and brought it down across Sarah's back, once, twice, 3 times. Sarah bit through her lip, trying not to scream because she knew that her pain was entertainment for white people, and she refused to give them that satisfaction. But by the 10th lash, she couldn't hold back anymore. She screamed and cried and begged for it to stop, but the whipping continued until all 20 lashes had been delivered. They cut her down, and she collapsed in the dirt, her back a mass of open wounds and blood. Her mother ran to her, cradling her, sobbing. Jonathan Sr. stood over them and spoke in a cold voice. Let this be a lesson. Negroes who try to rise above their station will be put back down, hard. Sarah spent the next week in bed, fever burning through her body as her wounds became infected. Her mother treated the injuries with whatever remedies she could make from plants and prayers. But there was no real medicine. No doctor who would help a Negro child. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes dreaming that she was back in the stable learning to read, sometimes dreaming that the words from books were crawling across her skin like ants, burning her wherever they touched. Thomas visited once, bringing bandages and a bottle of carbolic acid to clean the wounds. He looked at Sarah's destroyed back and began crying, which made Sarah angry. She was the one who had been whipped. She was the one suffering. And he was crying because he felt guilty. Get out, she whispered. This is your fault. You wanted to see if a Negro could learn, and now you know. We can learn, we can read, we can understand everything you understand, and you punish us for it. So get out and don't ever come back. Thomas left. Sarah never saw him bring another book. The experiment was over, but the story wasn't finished. Not by a long way. Sarah survived. By late November, the wounds on her back had healed into thick, raised scars that would mark her for the rest of her life. She returned to work in the stable, moving slowly, still in pain, but alive. Moses watched her with sad eyes and said nothing. What was there to say? She had reached for something that wasn't meant for her, and she had been punished for it. That was how the world worked. But Sarah hadn't forgotten about the paper she had copied from Richard's journal. She asked Thomas about it once, catching him alone in the stable. The paper I gave you, do you still have it? Thomas nodded. I hid it in my room. But Sarah, what good does it do? Who would we show it to? I don't know yet, but someday someone might care. Someone might want proof of what your family does to black people. Thomas looked uncomfortable. My family isn't evil, Sarah. My father is just trying to maintain order. Richard is trying to contribute to medical science. They're not monsters. Sarah stared at him. Your brother cut open a conscious 8-year-old child to see how much pain he could endure. Your father had me whipped until I couldn't stand. But they're not monsters. Thomas had no answer to that. What neither of them knew was that Richard had noticed the missing page from his journal. He had counted the entries, compared them to his table of contents, and realized that the page describing subject number 23 was gone. Someone had torn it out or copied it, and there was only one person he could think of who would have the reading skills and the motive to do such a thing. Richard began watching Sarah. He noticed how her eyes sometimes followed text on signs or labels. He noticed how she moved her lips slightly when looking at printed words, as if silently reading. He realized with shock and anger that his youngest brother had taught a Negro to read, and that Negro had used that skill to steal information from his private journal. Richard went to his father. That girl, the one Thomas taught to read, she's been stealing information from my medical research. She knows things she shouldn't know. Jonathan Sr.'s face darkened. We already punished her. Not enough. She's still dangerous. She knows what I've been doing. And if she tells the wrong people, we could have problems. Who's going to believe a Negro child? Maybe no one. But why take the risk? We should get rid of her. Make it look like an accident. Negro children die all the time from disease. From accidents. No one would investigate. Jonathan Sr. was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No, we're not murderers. We've already punished her severely. If we kill a child, even a Negro child, it could bring attention we don't want. Let it be. But Richard wasn't satisfied. He had spent years building his research, documenting experiments that would make his name in medical circles. He couldn't let a Negro child ruin that. If his father wouldn't act, then Richard would handle it himself. On December 15th, 1886, Sarah was called to the big house. Mrs. Margaret needed help moving furniture in the attic. It was a strange request since Sarah usually only worked in the stable, but she obeyed. She walked to the main house, climbed the stairs to the attic, and found Richard waiting for her instead of Mrs. Margaret. "Close the door," Richard said calmly. Sarah's heart began to pound. She knew danger when she saw it, but she couldn't run, couldn't refuse a direct order from a Whitmore. She closed the door. Richard locked it. "I know what you did," he said quietly. "I know you copied from my journal. I know you can read. I know you think you're clever, stealing white people's knowledge, thinking you can use it against us." Sarah said nothing. Her eyes darted around the attic, looking for another way out. There was a window, but it was small and stuck shut. "Here's what's going to happen," Richard continued. "You're going to give me whatever you copied, and then you're going to forget everything you learned to read. You're going to go back to being a simple Negro who knows her place. If you don't, I'll make sure your family suffers, not just eviction. I'll make sure they have accidents. Your father could fall from a wagon. Your mother could drink contaminated water. Your little sister could get sick from an infected cut. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Sarah understood perfectly. He was threatening to kill her family if she didn't cooperate. "I don't have the paper anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "I gave it to someone." "Who?" "I won't tell you." Richard moved closer, his face twisted with rage. "You will tell me, or I'll start with your sister. She's only 8 years old. I could make her subject number 45. Would you like to know what I have planned for my next experiment?" Sarah backed away until she hit the wall. This was it. This was how it ended. She was going to die here, or her family was going to die, or maybe everyone was going to die, all because she had wanted to learn to read. But then something unexpected happened. The attic door burst open, lock shattered, and Thomas stood there with a crowbar in his hand. "Get away from her, Richard." Richard spun around, shocked. "What are you doing here? Moses told me you called Sarah up here. I knew you were going to do something. I won't let you hurt her. She's a threat to this family, Thomas. She knows things. I know what she knows. I know about your experiments. I've read your journal. All of it." Thomas pulled papers from his pocket. Not just the page Sarah had copied, but dozens of pages he had secretly copied from Richard's journal over the past weeks. "I have proof of everything you've done, every person you hurt, every law you broke. And if you touch her, I'll make sure these papers get to the authorities." Richard laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "The authorities won't care. They're experiments on Negroes. Maybe the Mississippi authorities won't care, but I'll send these to newspapers in New York and Boston. I'll send them to medical schools where your colleagues work. I'll make sure everyone knows that Richard Whitmore isn't a scientist. He's a sadist who tortures helpless people and calls it research. Your reputation will be destroyed." The two brothers stared at each other. Finally, Richard stepped back. "You're choosing a Negro over your own brother. I'm choosing right over wrong. Get out of here, Richard, and stay away from Sarah and her family." Richard left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Thomas turned to Sarah, his face pale. "Are you okay?" Sarah nodded, too shocked to speak. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. "I'm sorry for all of it, for teaching you to read and putting you in danger, for my family and what they've done, for not standing up sooner. I can't fix any of it, but I can make sure you're safe from now on. I promise." It was the promise of a 12-year-old boy who meant well, but understood nothing about power or safety or how the world really worked. But in that moment, Sarah believed him. Things were quiet for a while after that. Richard stopped his experiments, at least the obvious ones. He returned to New Orleans in January 1887, supposedly to study at a hospital there, but really because the tension between him and Thomas had become unbearable. Jonathan Sr. focused on managing the plantation and pretended nothing had happened. Margaret went about her social life as if there were no problems in her perfect family. Sarah continued working in the stable. She didn't try to read anymore, didn't practice writing, didn't look at books. The scars on her back reminded her every day what happened when black people tried to educate themselves. She worked, she obeyed, she stayed quiet, she survived, but she didn't forget. And neither did Moses. One evening in March 1887, Moses called Sarah aside and spoke to her in his quiet, careful way. "Child, I need to tell you something. I'm dying. Got the consumption in my lungs. Won't make it through summer." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. Moses had been kind to her in his careful way. "I'm sorry, Mr. Moses." "Don't be sorry. I'm old and I'm tired." But before I go, I need to tell you something I never told nobody about this plantation. About what happened here before the war. Sarah listened as Moses told her a story he had kept secret for 50 years. During slavery times, the Whitmore plantation had been one of the cruelest in Mississippi. They had worked slaves to death and bought new ones to replace them. They had separated families, selling children away from parents. They had punished the smallest infractions with brutal violence. And worst of all, they had participated in what they called breeding programs, forcing slaves to produce children who would be sold for profit. "There's graves out in the woods," Moses said. "Hundreds of graves from all the folks who died here. Nobody marked them. Nobody remembers their names, but they're there, and their suffering is written in this soil." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because you can read and write now, child, even if you ain't practicing it, and somebody needs to write down what really happened here. Somebody needs to remember the dead, say their names, tell their stories. I can't do it, but maybe someday you can." Moses died in June 1887. They buried him in the colored cemetery without a marker. Just another forgotten black man who had lived and suffered and died in Mississippi. But Sarah remembered his words. Somebody needed to write down the truth. Somebody needed to remember. For the next 3 years, Sarah lived quietly. She turned 13, then 14, then 15. She grew taller but stayed thin because food was always scarce. The scars on her back faded from angry red to pale white, but they never disappeared. She worked, she obeyed, she survived, but in private she was learning again, not from books this time, but from watching and listening. She learned how the plantation really worked, how money flowed from workers' labor into the Whitmore's pockets. She learned which families were deepest in debt, which children were hungry, which women were being used by white men who thought black women had no right to refuse. She learned the hidden history of the place, the crimes that had been committed, the people who had died, and in late 1889, Richard returned. He had been gone for nearly 3 years, and he came back different. His medical practice in New Orleans had failed. He had tried to publish his research on racial biology, but journals had rejected his papers as poorly designed and ethically questionable. He had no reputation, no prospects, no future. So he came home to Mississippi with bitterness in his heart and a desperate need to prove himself. Richard set up his practice again in the east wing of the mansion, but this time he was more careful. He didn't advertise his experiments. He didn't keep obvious records. He selected subjects who wouldn't be missed. Elderly workers, sick children, people who were already dying. He told families he was providing medical treatment, and they believed him because they had no choice. But he was doing the same experiments as before, just more secretly. Testing pain tolerance, trying dangerous medicines, performing unnecessary surgeries to observe results. And this time he had learned from his mistakes. He kept his journal locked in a safe. He burned evidence after each experiment. He was careful never to be alone with subjects, always having his brother Jonathan Jr. or a trusted servant present as witness to his medical treatment. Sarah heard the whispers again. More workers going to Richard for help and coming back worse than before. More mysterious deaths attributed to disease or accident. More children crying because the doctor had hurt them. It was starting again, and this time there would be no proof, no evidence, no way to stop it. Sarah was 15 years old now, old enough to understand that silence wasn't survival, it was complicity. If she did nothing, more people would die. But if she tried to act, she would probably be killed. It was an impossible choice. And then in January 1890, something happened that made the choice for her. Sarah's little sister, Ruth Jr., got sick with a fever. Their mother tried home remedies, but the fever got worse. Finally, desperate, Ruth took her daughter to Richard for help. Richard examined the child, diagnosed pneumonia, and prescribed a medicine he had recently acquired from a pharmaceutical company in New York. "Give her 2 spoonfuls every 4 hours, he instructed. She should improve within a week. Ruth gave her daughter the medicine as directed, but instead of improving, Ruth Jr. got worse. The fever spiked higher. She began coughing blood. She convulsed and cried out in pain. 3 days after starting the medicine, Ruth Jr. died in her mother's arms. She was 11 years old. Richard's official diagnosis was pneumonia complicated by weak constitution common to Negro children. The death certificate listed natural causes. No investigation was conducted. It was just another dead black child and nobody cared. But Sarah knew. She knew that her sister had been sick but not dying until Richard gave her that medicine. She knew that Richard was experimenting again, probably testing a new drug to see its effects on black patients. She knew her sister had been murdered, even if no white person would ever admit it. Sarah's grief turned into rage, and rage turned into determination. She was going to stop Richard, no matter the cost. She was going to expose what he was doing. She was going to make sure people knew the truth. But how? She had no proof anymore. Richard kept everything locked up. He was careful now, much more careful than before. And even if Sarah could get evidence, who would listen to her? She was a 15-year-old black girl with whip scars on her back and a reputation as an educated Negro who had already been punished once for stepping out of her place. The answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas. Thomas was 17 now, almost a man, and he had been away at college for the past year. He came home for Christmas break in December 1889 and stayed through January. He saw Sarah at the funeral for Ruth. Junior saw her mother's devastation, saw her father's broken face, and he knew that Richard was responsible. Thomas came to Sarah in the stable a week after the funeral. "I need to know what happened to your sister." Sarah looked at him with dead eyes. "Your brother killed her, gave her medicine that poisoned her. But nobody's going to believe that. I believe it, and I think I can prove it." Thomas explained that he had been studying chemistry at college, learning about medicines and compounds. "If Richard is testing experimental drugs, he probably keeps samples. If I can get those samples, I can have them analyzed. If they're poisonous or dangerous, that's evidence. And then what? You show the evidence to who? Your father? The sheriff who's friends with your family?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I have a professor at college who writes for northern newspapers. He's published articles about conditions in the South, about lynching and segregation. If I can get him proof of what Richard is doing, he'll publish it. Not in Mississippi, but in newspapers where people might actually care. It was a long shot. It probably wouldn't work, but it was the only shot they had." Over the next 6 months, Thomas and Sarah worked together in secret. Thomas stole samples of medicines from Richard's office. Sarah watched Richard's routines and reported when he was experimenting on someone new. Thomas copied pages from Richard's new journal, which Richard thought was safely locked away, but which Thomas had learned to access using a spare key. Slowly, carefully, they gathered evidence. They documented at least 15 cases where Richard had caused harm to patients under the guise of medical treatment. They collected samples of 4 different experimental drugs that Richard was testing without permission. They copied Richard's notes describing his research into racial biology and pain tolerance. By July 1890, they had enough. Thomas prepared a package of evidence to send to his professor in Boston. Copies of journal entries, samples of medicines, sworn statements that Thomas himself had written describing what he had witnessed. It was all there. Everything needed to expose Richard as a fraud and a sadist. But before Thomas could send the package, Richard discovered what they were doing. It was Jonathan Jr. who figured it out. He noticed Thomas spending time in areas he shouldn't be in. He noticed supplies going missing from Richard's office. He set a trap marking certain items so he could track them and watched as Thomas took the bait. On July 15, 1890, Jonathan Jr. confronted Thomas with the evidence. "You're stealing from Richard, you're planning to expose him, and you're working with that Negro girl again." Thomas didn't deny it. "What Richard is doing is wrong. He's torturing people, killing children. Someone has to stop him. He's conducting medical research on inferior races. That's not torture." "That's science. It's murder, Jonathan. He killed a little girl. He's killed others, and you know it." Jonathan Jr. stared at his younger brother with contempt. "You're weak, Thomas. You always have been. Father should have beaten that weakness out of you years ago, but it's not too late to correct this mistake." That night, the Whitmore family held a meeting. Jonathan Sr., Margaret, Jonathan Jr., Richard, and Thomas all gathered in the study. Sarah, serving coffee to the family, heard every word from her position near the door. "You've betrayed your family," Jonathan Sr. said to Thomas, his voice cold with fury. "You've sided with Negroes against your own blood. You've stolen private documents. You've conspired to destroy your brother's reputation. Why?" Thomas's voice was steady. "Because what Richard is doing is evil. And if I don't stop him, I'm as guilty as he is." "Evil?" Margaret laughed, a harsh sound. "Performing research on inferior beings is evil. Your brother is contributing to science, proving what our race has always known. That Negroes are fundamentally different, less human, more resistant to pain. His work could change medical practice, could justify the proper ordering of society. And you want to destroy it because you have some sentimental attachment to a Negro child. She's not a thing, Mother. She's a person. They're all people. Everything you believe about racial inferiority is a lie created to justify cruelty. Richard stood up, his face red with rage. I should have killed that girl years ago when I had the chance. She's poisoned your mind, turned you against us, but it's not too late to fix this. What are you suggesting? Jonathan Sr. asked. We get rid of the evidence. We get rid of the girl. We send Thomas away where he can't cause more problems. We protect this family. Thomas jumped up. If you hurt Sarah, I swear You'll what? Jonathan Jr. grabbed Thomas and pushed him back into his chair. You're 17 years old, boy. You got no power here. You'll do what Father tells you, or you'll be disowned and thrown out with nothing. The argument continued for another hour. Voices rose and fell. Threats were made. Finally, Jonathan Sr. made a decision. Thomas, you'll return to college tomorrow and you'll stay there. You will not contact that Negro girl. You will not speak of Richard's research to anyone. If you disobey, I'll cut you off completely and I'll make sure that girl and her family pay the price. Do you understand? Thomas understood. He was trapped, just like Sarah was trapped, just like every black person in Mississippi was trapped. Power belonged to those who had it, and the powerless could only survive. But Thomas did one last thing before he left. He took the package of evidence he had prepared, and he hid it. Not in the house where his family could find it, but in the stable buried in the floor beneath a loose board wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. And he whispered to Sarah where it was hidden. If something happens to me, he said, if this family tries to cover up what Richard has done, the evidence is there. Use it however you can. Then Thomas left for college and Sarah was alone again. For the next year, things were tense but quiet on the Whitmore plantation. Richard continued his experiments more carefully than ever. Jonathan Jr. watched everyone for signs of rebellion or disloyalty. Margaret maintained the family's social position, and Jonathan Sr. ran the plantation with an iron fist, squeezing every penny of profit from his workers while keeping them trapped in debt. Sarah turned 16. She worked. She obeyed. She survived. But she was planning. She knew where the evidence was hidden. She knew what Richard had done. And she knew that someday, somehow, there would be a reckoning. That reckoning came in March 1891. It started with a letter. Thomas wrote to Sarah, smuggling the letter through a sympathetic church minister who sometimes visited the plantation. The letter was brief and desperate. Richard is coming after me. He found out I kept copies of evidence. He's threatening to have me committed to an asylum unless I turn over everything. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Please, if something happens to me, make sure the truth comes out. Sarah never got a chance to respond. 2 weeks later, news came that Thomas had died in a fire at his college dormitory. The official story was that he had fallen asleep while smoking, and the cigarette had ignited his bedding. But Sarah knew better. She knew that Richard had found a way to silence his brother permanently. When the Whitmore family brought Thomas's body home for burial, Sarah saw her chance. During the funeral, while the family was at the church, Sarah went to the stable and dug up the package Thomas had hidden. She opened it and looked through the evidence. Journal entries describing experiments, medicine samples, Thomas's written testimony. It was all there. Everything needed to prove what Richard had done. But there was something else in the package, too. Something Sarah hadn't expected. A letter from Thomas to her, written weeks earlier, but never sent. She read it by lamplight in the stable, tears running down her face. Dear Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. I'm sorry I couldn't stop my family from hurting you and your people. I'm sorry I ever thought teaching you to read would be enough to change things. I was naive. I thought knowledge and truth were enough to defeat evil, but I was wrong. Evil doesn't care about truth, it just cares about power. But maybe you can do what I couldn't. Maybe you can use this evidence to hurt my family the way they've hurt so many others. I don't know how, and I don't know if it's even possible, but if anyone can find a way, it's you. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Sarah. You survived things that would have broken me. You learned to read when the whole world told you that you couldn't and shouldn't, and if you tried, you would be destroyed. But you learned anyway. And maybe that strength is enough. Maybe you can find justice where I couldn't. I hope so. I really hope so. Your friend, Thomas Sarah, sat in the stable for a long time after reading that letter, thinking about justice and revenge and the impossibility of either. How could she, a 16-year-old black girl with no power and no voice, possibly bring down a wealthy white family? Who would listen to her? Who would care? But then she thought about her sister Ruth Jr. dead at 11 from Richard's poison. She thought about little James cut open while conscious because Richard wanted to measure his pain. She thought about all the people who had suffered and died at the Whitmore's hands. All the crimes that had been committed and covered up and justified with lies about racial science and natural order. And she realized that maybe justice was impossible, but revenge might not be impossible at all. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks planning. She couldn't defeat the Waiters through law or public exposure, that much was clear, but there were other ways to hurt them. She thought about burning the plantation to the ground, but that would harm the workers who lived there. She thought about poisoning the family, but she had no access to their food and no knowledge of poisons. She thought about trying to escape north and taking the evidence with her, but she had no money for travel and no contacts who could help. Finally, she decided on a different approach. If she couldn't bring the Whitmores to justice, she would let their own secrets destroy them. She would make sure the evidence was found, but not by authorities who would ignore it. Instead, she would create a situation so dramatic, so shocking, that someone would have to investigate. Someone would have to look deeper. Someone would have to find the truth. Sarah's plan was simple, but dangerous. On the night of March 17, 1891, when the Whitmore family was asleep, she would start a fire in the East Wing where Richard kept his office, but before the fire she would arrange evidence where it would be found. Richard's journals, medicine samples, Thomas's testimony. She would make it look like Richard had been storing damning evidence in his office, and the fire had exposed it. Investigators would find proof of his crimes. Maybe they wouldn't care about black victims, but they would care that a respected doctor had falsified medical research. They would care that he had lied about his credentials. They would care that he had potentially murdered his own brother. It wasn't perfect. It probably wouldn't lead to real justice, but it was something. It was all she had. On the night of March 17, 1891, Sarah put her plan into action. She waited until midnight when the household was asleep. She crept into the big house through a servant's entrance that she knew was never locked. She made her way to Richard's office in the East Wing, moving silently through the dark hallways. But when she reached the office, she found it wasn't empty. Richard was there, working late by lamplight, writing in his journal. He looked up when Sarah entered, and his face twisted with recognition and rage. I should have killed you years ago." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway. This wasn't supposed to happen. Richard wasn't supposed to be here. "I just came to, I know why you came. Thomas told you where he hid evidence before he died. You came to get it. Or maybe you came to kill me." Richard stood up slowly, moving toward her. "But you're too late. I found Thomas's hiding place weeks ago. I burned everything. There's no proof left of anything." Sarah felt her heart sink. It had all been for nothing. Thomas had died for nothing. All the planning, all the hope, it was all pointless. But then, Richard made a mistake. He laughed, a cruel sound. "You really thought you could hurt this family? You're nothing, girl. You're a Negro who learned to read and thought that made you special. But knowledge doesn't give you power. Only power gives you power. And you have none." Something inside Sarah broke, not broke like glass breaks, shattering into pieces. Broke like a dam breaks, releasing years of trapped pressure all at once. She had been beaten. She had been scarred. She had lost her sister. She had watched Thomas die. She had endured years of humiliation and fear and pain, all because she had wanted to learn, to know, to understand. And this man, this monster, was telling her it had all been meaningless. Sarah grabbed the oil lamp from Richard's desk and threw it at him. The glass shattered against his chest, spraying burning oil across his shirt and face. Richard screamed and stumbled backward, flames spreading across his body. He crashed into shelves of papers and books, igniting them. Within seconds, the entire office was on fire. Sarah ran. She ran through the hallway, down the stairs, out of the house. Behind her, she heard screams as the family woke up to find their home burning. She didn't stop running until she reached the woods at the edge of the plantation. From the trees, she watched the Whitmore mansion burn. She watched people run out of the house in their nightclothes. She watched servants form bucket brigades trying to fight the fire. She watched as volunteer firefighters arrived too late to save anything. And then she saw something that she would remember for the rest of her life. As the East Wing collapsed, 5 figures appeared in the flames. Not running, not screaming, just standing there like they were waiting for something. Sarah couldn't see their faces clearly through the smoke and fire, but she knew who they were. Jonathan Sr., Margaret Jonathan Jr., Richard, and Thomas's ghost come back to join them. The next morning, when firefighters finally controlled the blaze and searched the ruins, they found 5 bodies arranged in a circle in what had been the main hall, their hands crossed over their chests. It was impossible to explain, People don't stop to arrange themselves neatly while burning to death. But there they were, positioned deliberately, like they had been placed there by someone or something. The official investigation lasted 2 days. Sheriff Tucker declared it an accidental fire caused by an overturned oil lamp. No one mentioned that it had started in Richard's locked office. No one asked why the bodies were arranged so strangely. No one investigated further. The Whitmores were buried, their property was sold to pay debts, and the plantation was broken up into smaller holdings. And Sarah disappeared. Some said she ran north to freedom. Some said she died in the woods from exposure. Some said she had been taken by spirits as punishment for starting the fire. But the truth was simpler. Sarah walked away from the Whitmore plantation on the morning of March 18, 1891, and she kept walking until she reached a different county, a different life, a different name. Years later, in 1923, a black woman named Sarah Freeman published a small book through a colored publishing house in Chicago. The book was called Witnesses to Pain, a record of medical crimes against black Americans, 1883-1891. It contained detailed accounts of experiments performed on black patients by a Mississippi doctor, supported by copies of journal entries, testimonies, and evidence. The book was ignored by mainstream publishers and reviewers, but it circulated through black communities, through churches and schools and reading groups. It became part of the hidden history that black people kept alive when white history tried to erase them. Nobody ever definitively proved that Sarah Freeman was the same Sarah who had worked on the Whitmore plantation. But the book contained details that only someone who had been there could have known, and in the introduction the author wrote, "This book is dedicated to Ruth Jr., who died at age 11 from a doctor's experiment, and to Thomas, who tried to do the right thing and paid with his life, and to all the people whose pain was measured, recorded, and dismissed as less than human. You were human. You are remembered." 30 years after the book was published, a young lawyer named Charles Hamilton Houston used evidence from Witnesses to Pain to support arguments in civil rights cases, challenging medical experimentation on black patients without consent. The book became a small but significant piece of the larger fight for justice and equality. And 70 years after the Whitmore fire in 1961, a historian researching Mississippi plantation records found something strange in the Warren County archives, a collection of damaged papers that had survived a fire. The papers were medical journals describing experiments on black patients in the 1880s and 1890s. They had been preserved as evidence in the Whitmore fire investigation, then forgotten in a filing cabinet for 7 decades. The historian published excerpts from these journals in an academic paper about medical racism in the post-Civil War South. The paper was cited by other researchers who used it to support broader arguments about systemic racism in American medicine. The crimes that Richard Whitmore thought he had hidden forever became part of the historical record. Proof of what Sarah and Thomas had always known, that the powerful will hurt the powerless unless someone stands up and says no. Sarah lived to be 87 years old. She died in 1961 in Chicago, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had all gone to college, who had all learned to read in real schools with real teachers. She had taught them to read when they were young, using the same patience and determination she had used to teach herself 78 years earlier in a Mississippi stable. And before she died, she told them the story of how she learned to read and what that knowledge had cost her and why it had been worth it. "Education is dangerous," she told her grandchildren. "Not because it makes you forget your place, like white folks used to say, but because it shows you that the place they put you in was never natural or right or God-given. It was just a cage built by people. And what people build, people can tear down. I tore down one cage when I burned that house, but you're going to tear down bigger cages than I ever could. You're going to use your education to fight laws, change minds, build a world where no child has to hide in a stable to learn their letters." That's why they were so afraid of black people reading, not because we'd become equal to them, but because we'd realize we always were. Sarah Freeman died on a Tuesday in November 1961, and she was buried in a cemetery on Chicago's South Side with a proper headstone that read, "Sarah Freeman, 1874-1961. She taught herself to read and taught others to fight." The story of what happened at the Whitmore plantation in 1891 was never fully told in any official history. The fire was forgotten. The family was forgotten. Even the plantation itself was eventually subdivided so many times that nobody remembered it had once been a single large holding. But the story survived in other ways. In whispered family histories, in small books published by colored presses, in academic papers that cited anonymous sources, in the memories of people who understood that official history only tells part of the truth. The real lesson of Sarah's story isn't about how one girl learned to read against impossible odds, though that's remarkable enough. It's about what happened when that girl used her education not just to improve her own life, but to fight back against the system that had tried to keep her ignorant. She didn't win a complete victory. Most of the Whitmore's crimes were never officially acknowledged or punished. The racial structures that enabled those crimes continued long after the family died. But Sarah did something that mattered anyway. She refused to let those crimes be forgotten. She made sure there was evidence, testimony, a record that future generations could find and use. And maybe that's the real power of education. Not that it makes you equal to people who think they're superior, but that it gives you tools to document truth, to preserve memory, to pass knowledge down to people who can use it to keep fighting. Sarah taught herself to read with dirt and scraps. She used that reading to expose crimes that authorities wanted to hide. And when she couldn't get justice in her own time, she made sure the truth survived for people who might find justice later. The Whitmore family died in flames on March 17, 1891. Their bodies arranged in a circle that no one could explain. Some said it was divine justice. Some said it was just a strange accident of how they fell when the house collapsed. But Sarah knew the truth, and she took it to her grave. She had started the fire that killed Richard, but she hadn't arranged those bodies. She had run away before anyone died. Someone or something else had positioned those corpses so deliberately, so carefully in that perfect circle with their hands crossed over their chests. Maybe it was Thomas's ghost taking revenge on the family that had killed him. Maybe it was the spirits of all the people Richard had tortured finally getting their justice. Or maybe it was just the fever dreams of a terrified girl who watched a house burn and imagined meaning in random tragedy. But Sarah never stopped believing that something supernatural had happened that night. Some force had judged the whites and found them guilty and had arranged their bodies as a message. These people died for their crimes. Remember them. Remember what they did. Don't let it happen again. And people did remember. Not everyone and not officially, but enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to keep fighting. Enough to teach the next generation to read, to question, to refuse to accept that cruelty is natural or hierarchy is God-given or power is permanent. Sarah taught herself to read in a stable in 1883. That act of rebellion led to pain, loss, violence, and death, but it also led to justice eventually in small ways for people who came after. And maybe that's all anyone can hope for, to fight the evil in front of you, to document the truth as best you can, and to trust that someone in the future will pick up where you left off. The Whitmore plantation is gone now, subdivided into tract housing and strip malls. Nobody remembers that it once stretched across 120 acres where black people were worked to death and experimented on and treated as less than human. Nobody remembers the families who lived there, the children who died there, the suffering that soaked into that soil, but Sarah remembered and she wrote it down. And because she wrote it down, we remember too. That's the real power of reading and writing, not just to learn what others have written, but to write your own truth when official voices won't speak it, to be a witness, to refuse to let crimes be forgotten, to pass knowledge forward like a torch, hoping someone ahead can see by its light. Sarah was 9 years old when she taught herself to read. She was 16 when she burned down a plantation house and killed the man who had murdered her sister. She was 87 when she died, having lived long enough to see the beginnings of the civil rights movement, having contributed in small but real ways to the fight for justice. And every single thing she accomplished started with 6 letters drawn in the dirt of a stable floor. Uphill E. That's how revolutions begin. Not with armies or laws or dramatic speeches, but with one person deciding that knowledge belongs to everyone, that education is a human right, not a racial privilege, that truth matters even when powerful people say it doesn't. Sarah taught herself to read when the whole world told her that black children couldn't learn, shouldn't learn, and would be destroyed if they tried. She learned anyway, and in learning, she helped destroy the people who had tried to destroy her. That's not just a story about one girl in 1880s Mississippi. That's a story about power and education and the long, slow fight for justice that continues to this day. It's a reminder that knowledge is dangerous to those who depend on ignorance, and it's proof that sometimes the most radical act of resistance is simply refusing to stay ignorant when ignorance is required. Sarah taught herself to read, and in doing so, she helped write a different future than the one the Whiters had planned. Not a perfect future, not even a fair future, not yet, but a future where her story could be told, remembered, and used to inspire others who also refuse to accept that their place is to be silent, obedient, and grateful for crumbs. That's the legacy of a 9-year-old girl who found a torn page from a book in a horse toll and decided that those 6 letters, a PPL, Pili, were worth risking everything to understand. And that legacy continues every time someone learns to read despite obstacles. Every time someone documents truth that powerful people want hidden. Every time someone refuses to let crimes be forgotten or victims be erased. Sarah's spirit lives on in all of those acts of resistance and remembrance. The Whitmore family burned in 1891. But Sarah's story survived, and as long as people keep telling it, keep learning from it, keep using it to fight for justice, then maybe all that suffering and pain and loss meant something after all. Maybe that's the only kind of victory possible in a world this broken. Not to win completely, but to refuse to be silenced. Not to achieve perfect justice, but to make sure the truth survives. Not to tear down all the cages at once, but to teach the next generation where to find the keys. Sarah taught herself to read in 1883.